Alrighty, well, just to be respectful of everyone's time, we do have a decent number of attendees here. So I'm going to go ahead and start our welcome so we can get started just momentarily. So thank you for joining us for today's webinar with Jill Guth of Guth Associates. Today, the presentation is on navigating the commercial leasing process. Just a few quick housekeeping things before we kick off the presentation. Your cameras and microphones will stay off. So if you have any questions, you could submit those via the chat box and we will get them covered before we close out today's session. You'll also get a follow-up email later this afternoon with a link to the recording and a Dropbox link to a PDF version of the presentation so you can go back and revisit the information or share it with someone on your team if needed. So I will hand it over to Jill and we can get started.
Thanks, Jordan, and thanks for everybody that are here today. I run multiple screens, so it's not that I'm like I am looking a little bit away, but bear with me. And again, thanks to the EDC and the SBDC for hosting this. This presentation came about when I, in the past, have taught at the Monticello Small Business Boot Camp, and I've done it many, many times. I've never done it as a webinar. It's always been live and interactive. So again, bear with me as I'm used to people stopping me and asking questions and being much more interactive, but we'll all do our best. Guth Associates is in its 10th year as a commercial real estate firm here in Champaign County. We specialize in office, retail, restaurant, industrial investment on both the leasing and the purchase side. So we're going to jump right into this, and at the very end or throughout you can submit questions via chat, and Jordan's going to let me know at the end, and hopefully we can make this a lot more interactive towards the end. So I'll get through these slides and then we'll have lots of time for questions and answers. So I'm talking hopefully to startups or emerging early stage businesses here, and you've decided it's time to go brick and mortar. And the first question everyone should ask themselves is, do I want to lease a space or do I want to purchase a space? Typically with startups and early stage businesses, we're focused on leasing just because the purchase of a building is such a large capital outlay that it makes a lot more sense to focus on leasing with the eventual hope of someday owning your own real estate. So this presentation is really based on leasing. But we're always available at any time to answer questions about purchasing a property. So when you have decided that, yes, I want to find a brick and mortar, I want to start looking for a space to lease, a lot of times we see people that just jump in and start touring spaces with no business plan, no serious thought on what they exactly need. So we want you at Guth Associates to step back and start asking yourself some questions before you even start looking at spaces. So I want to go through some of those questions. And what I encourage folks to do is get a pen and paper when they're going to do this process and just start writing it all down. So it's time to dream. What does your perfect space look like? Are you an office user? Are you a retailer? Are you a restaurant? Do you need warehouse space? Start thinking about that perfect space and start thinking about how many square feet you think you need. And a lot of people will come to me and go, I have no idea. Then go out and walk through competitors, walk through spaces to get a feel for them. But try to come up with some idea what you need. When I say square feet, a lot of times we'll have people that say, let's say I need 1,000 square feet now, but we also need to think about what you're going to need in 2 to 3 or 4 years. So we want you to have enough space to meet your needs now, but also to have some growth so you don't have to move a year after you get into a 5-year lease because you're already out of space. What does your ideal location look like? Do you need foot traffic? Are you pedestrian dependent? Do you need to be on a high traffic corridor, meaning you are vehicular dependent? Or is a location not that much of an issue? We have businesses that may be what I call destination based, a dentist. You just don't drive by a dentist and say, I'm going to stop there today. It is a destination. So sometimes someone like a dentist doesn't necessarily need to be on a high traffic corridor. The high traffic corridors tend to be more retail based and result in higher lease rates, higher monthly rent rates. So think about what is going to make your business thrive. You know, if you're on Green Street, you're pedestrian dependent. South Neal corridor is more high traffic corridor, more vehicular dependent. Or can you kind of be back a ways and it doesn't really matter. You're not going to have a lot of walk-ins, your back office. So think those things through. Does your space need special features? If you're a restaurant, you need a kitchen. Do you need a drive-through? Are you okay in a co-working space? Do you need high ceilings if you're a warehouse user or an industrial type user? Do you need a dock? Do you need overhead doors? So jot down all of those things that you think you need to make your business successful. Also, always remember there's something called zoning. I have had clients who say, I want a warehouse, but I want to be right in the core area of downtown. Industrial uses typically aren't in a downtown area. They're out more on the periphery in industrial parks. So think about zoning on the type of business you have. Champaign County GIS, and I'm sure Jordan could share a link, is a great resource where you can go to as a public member and type in your address, and it'll give you information on that location, and you can add in a overview layer or a layer of zoning for whatever community you're in, and you can find out what the zoning is for that property. Then you can obviously go to the City of Champaign zoning ordinance to understand what is permitted in that zoning classification. You have to be permitted in that zoning classification or be a conditional use permit or a special use permit to be in that location. So be sure you have your broker or yourself check the zoning on any location that you're looking at. What is your occupancy costs on an annual basis? When I talk about occupancy costs, I'm talking about your rent, your utilities, and if it is a triple net lease, those expenses. We'll talk about triple net in a little bit. Typically, we don't want to see occupancy costs on an annual basis more than 10% of your gross sales. It is dependent on the industry. Some industries, it could be 5% of your gross sales. So when we talk about rent, utilities, triple net expenses, put that in relationship to your gross sales. And again, your broker should be paying attention to that also. I had a client a year or two ago who their occupancy cost was going to be 40% of their gross sales. And I said, I don't think you can be successful. It's too high with all of the other expenses you're going to have on an annual basis. And so we had to step back and look at other things. It kind of changed their plan a little bit, but I think they'll be a lot more successful because they're not going to be what I call rent burdened or rent heavy. So next slide, please, Jordan. So another question to ask yourself is, when do you want to be up and running in your new space? Some people can find a space and it's move-in ready and they can move in and be up and running in a month. Other spaces may need improvements, renovations. There's time for lease negotiation. So think through when you want to be up and running. If you want to be up and running in January 1st, you may have to start your search August 1st, because it may take that long to find a space, negotiate the lease, and then do any improvements to that space. So kind of think through when you want to open the doors for your business. If your space needs some improvements, you got to have a budget for that. So when you're doing your business plan, which we're going to talk about next, think through that if you have to renovate the space, how you're going to fund that. Now, a lot of folks think that if a space needs renovated, well, the landlord should pay for that. And sometimes we can negotiate, you know, carpeting or flooring, paint, some improvements. But if it is a tenant-specific improvement, typically those are going to be your costs. So eyes wide open that landlords don't always pay for improvements, that the tenant will likely have some out of pocket on those improvements. Also pay attention as we get farther down the road on who's responsible for repairs and maintenance of things like HVAC, heating, air conditioning, plumbing. Heating and air conditioning are the biggest items that we negotiate on. Landlords are gravitating towards a situation where the tenant is responsible for the repairs and maintenance and annual maintenance on HVAC up to a certain limit. So we're seeing a lot of leases now that says you as a tenant are going to be provided in good working condition, air conditioning, heating system. You're responsible to repair it, let's say up to $1,000 a year. After that, it's the landlord's responsibility and or they're responsible for replacement. So these are things, as we talk about a lease further on, that you have to pay attention to on what is your responsibility for repairs and maintenance on a space you're looking at. This one's for Jordan and the SBDC. If you don't have a business plan and you're a startup, stop and start your business plan. I'm not the only one who will be asking for your business plan. I can guarantee it, if you're going to a bank for some working capital or some financing for some improvements, the bank is going to want to see your business plan. I've had landlords want to review a business plan. And all of these questions we're talking about are things that you're going to address in your business plan. How are you going to finance a project? Again, you may need working capital, you may need improvements. Are you working with the banker? Have you been pre-approved for a certain amount? Are you working with a banker that's trying to secure SBA financing for you? Do you have wealthy relatives? And figure out how you're going to pay for you know, up to probably 6 months of working capital to get your business off the ground, plus whatever renovations you may need for the space. Jordan? Next slide, please. So we need to find a home for your business. It's time to educate yourself. Drive around your desired geographic area. Provide examples of buildings you like, locations you like. Again, we've talked about special attributes that your space may need, but you need to spend some time doing your own research and looking at spaces, not inside, but just kind of the areas you think you want to be at. I have had clients, especially national quick casual restaurants, that the franchisee will literally sit in their car at the corner of an intersection for days on end, watching traffic flow. When is it busiest? Counting cars. Do your research. If you are traffic dependent and you think you have a site you might like, again, go sit there. See what days are busiest, what hours are busiest, and make sure you're comfortable with that traffic flow. You can also go on the Illinois Department of Transportation's website and get what we call average daily traffic counts. There is, if you go to DOT, just if you Google Illinois Department of Transportation traffic counts, it will pop up with a kind of like a GIS map. You can literally zoom in on an intersection in Champaign, Urbana, Mahomet, wherever, and see what the average daily traffic count is for that general area. That's really good information to know, especially if you're a traffic dependent business. There are tools to use, web-based tools to inventory, which provide an inventory of available spaces. So we use something called Crexy. So it's crexy.com. Anyone can get on that And a lot of brokerage firms and individuals will post their buildings that they have for lease or for sale on that site. There's also something called loopnet.com, also called CoStar Time, but loopnet.com is another Crexy type web-based application. Individual realtors have websites with their listings on it. Guth Associates has our own. And then we obviously have the multiple listing service. Not everyone obviously has access to that, but if you're working with a broker, they would be able to access the multiple listing service. I will tell you that not all commercial brokers put their commercial listings on the multiple listing service. We do, a couple others do. So that's why it's also good to check a Crexy, a LoopNet, or those individual realtors' websites to make sure you have a comprehensive list of the availability. Obviously, I'm going to advocate that you use a real estate broker to represent your interests. Hopefully one that has experience in commercial real estate. You obviously can represent yourself on a deal, but there are advantages to a real estate broker. We can help secure the tours, but more importantly, we're an advocate on your behalf. You know, my job is to make sure you get the best deal at the best location you can. We want you to realize your dream, but we want to realize your dream within your budget. And a lot of times I'm showing a client a wide variety of listings, and hopefully we're just funneling down to that one that kind of checks all the boxes. Sometimes we have to look at a lot of things within your price range and to finally get a client to go, okay, that's the one that works best for me. So again, you can use a real estate broker or you can represent yourself. I will tell you the world of real estate has changed. A lot of my clients will say, well, how do I have to pay you to represent my interests? Typically, the property owner is going to compensate the real estate broker. We're bringing them a client and most typically, that property owner is going to compensate the real estate broker and not the client. There has been lots of changes in the world. So your real estate broker may ask you and should ask you to sign a buyer broker agreement that kind of lays out the compensation if the property owner does not compensate you. We could spend a whole session on that. We're all still learning the new rules, but just be sure to ask upfront if you're using a broker, how they're going to be compensated, because in today's world, that may fall back on you as the small business. Jordan. So with the help of a broker or on your own, you've identified spaces. You're going to start reviewing those spaces, touring those spaces, seeing how they fit within your budget. Be sure to ask questions. Write down issues you see with that space. If it looks like somebody died on the carpeting, make sure you make a note of it, because that's going to be something you want to ask a landlord to replace at their expense. So, you know, look at those spaces, make sure it fits in your budget. Ask questions to either the property owner or the listing broker who's there at the tour, and make note of anything that might need improvement before you move in that you think is a landlord responsibility and not some kind of tenant improvement. When you are ready and you've decided that this is the space for you, typically what we're going to see is a letter of intent to lease, drafted, written, and submitted to the property owner for their review. Typically, a broker will prepare what we call the LOI. You can do that yourself, but this is something that is a service that the broker would put together for you. It could be one page, sometimes they're 2 or 3 pages, goes through a whole host of terms, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. And the letter of intent could be negotiated. It could be accepted immediately, or it could take multiple times back and forth to finally reach those agreed upon lease terms. I cannot stress enough that everything should be in writing. All negotiations should be in writing. I don't know how many times people text me and want to make offers via text. We don't do business via text. I cannot take verbal offers. Everything needs to be a writing. And that way, when we finally get to the actual lease development and lease negotiation, we can go back and see how those negotiations progressed and what was finally agreed to. So I know it's easy to text, but I would really encourage you to email your brokers so that there is much better paper trail on the negotiations. So let's assume that the lease term, the LOI, has been accepted. Then a lease is drafted. It is typically drafted by the property owner's attorney. I have seen leases that are 4 pages long, and I just reviewed a lease that was 92 pages long. And everywhere in between. I strongly suggest that that you have a good real estate attorney to review your lease, as well as your broker review the lease versus the LOI. I help negotiate the lease based on the business terms, but I can't do that on the legal terms, on the legal side of it. One, by law, and two, there's just no way that we have the expertise that an attorney does. We want to make sure that everything in the LOI is in the lease. Again, you're going to go back and forth several times, possibly on a lease. That's why you have a good real estate attorney and you have a broker. An example that we don't want to see happen is I provided a lease that was about 30 pages long to a tenant, soon to be tenant in a property. They signed it the same day. There is no way possible this tenant read the entire lease or had an attorney review the lease. And what happens a year later, there's a big fight over something that was clearly in the lease that they did not read, and they're responsible for it. So just take your time, read your lease, jot down questions. And again, send those questions to your broker or to your attorney to work through. Jordan? So let's jump into lease terminology. And a lot of these things are going to be in the LOI and in your lease. So things to start thinking about. Lease term. How long do you want your lease to be? We're talking about numbers of years here. The longer the lease, let's say a 10-year lease, the more negotiation power you have as a tenant with the property owner. If you are a restaurant and know that you're going to go in and put in, have to put in significant renovations into a space to meet your restaurant needs, you're not going to want a 2 or 3 year lease. You're going to want a longer term lease to, depreciate or amortize that capital across the term of the lease. It just doesn't make sense to put, $50,000 into a property that you don't own on a 1 or 2 year lease. So think about what you can live with as a term. As putting restaurants aside, retail, office, and you're a startup or you're an emerging early stage business, I'm probably going to try to get you in a 3-year lease or a 5-year lease, okay? To give you some flexibility, but that's something you need to think about. And again, the longer the lease, the more negotiation power you have as the tenant. We do not see very many 1-year leases. Security deposit. This is usually payable when you sign your lease. It is typically equal to 1 month's rent. If the landlord is a little concerned about the business or the financials that were provided, it could be more than 1 month's rent. It's really a negotiated term. I've seen up to 3 months rent. So just be prepared, but it is always payable at lease execution. One point on lease execution, typically we also see the first month's rent paid at lease execution. So you're going to have security deposit and potentially the first month's rent due when you sign the lease. earlier I mentioned triple net, and a component of triple net, which I'm going to spend more time on in a minute, is common area maintenance, but I just kind of want to define that term for you. Common area maintenance is commonly referred to as CAM. You'll hear the word CAM a lot. That usually includes things like exterior landscaping, snow removal, parking lot repairs, exterior parking lot lighting. If it's a multi-tenant building that has a fire suppression system, it may be the monitoring of that fire suppression system, those kinds of things. So it's things that serve the entire complex. We see these a lot in strip centers, multi-tenant buildings, where you see a lot of these common area maintenance charges. So rental rate. So you're perusing correctseed.com or LoopNet, and you see things like $12 a square foot or $25 a square foot. That is the base rental rate. It is always quoted as price per square foot per year. I've had folks go, you mean I have to pay $25 a square foot per month? No, it's quoted per year. So an example, if it's quoted at $12 a square foot, and there is 1,000 square foot space you're looking at, your monthly rent is calculated at 12 times 1,000, which is $12,000 in annual rent, divided by 12 months, which would give you $1,000 a month in rent. So you take the base square footage amount, like I said, 12 times the square footage of the space gives you your annual rent. If you divide that by 12, you would get what your monthly rent is. Jordan? Okay, so there are lots of types of leases in the world. Typically, you're going to hear triple net, which is abbreviation NNN, or you're going to hear a gross lease. You might hear about a modified gross lease. You might hear about a double N lease. But typically what we see in the market is triple net versus gross leases. We would all on the tenant side love to just have gross leases, but that is not the way of the world. Triple net is an additional rent charge that is charged on a pro rata basis, meaning based on the square footage you have, for the property taxes, the building insurance, and common area maintenance, which we just talked about. This is an additional charge to the base rent. So triple net is expressed as an annual per square foot cost, similar to the base rent. So triple net in this example would be $4 a square foot, additional to the 12 we just talked about. So if your base rent was 12, or let me use the example below, if your base rent was 14 and there's an additional $4, you're really paying $18 a square foot in rent. Triple net is adjusted on an annual basis. So every, let's say, December, your property owner would provide you a budget for the upcoming year. So they're estimating what their property taxes are going to be, what their building insurance is going to be, and what their common area maintenance is going to be for the upcoming year. At the end of the year, there is something called a reconciliation done, where the property owner goes back and says, okay, this was the budget, but here's what the actual costs were. Good property owners are pretty close every year on that. If the budget came in, or the actual came in lower than the budget, you would get a rent credit applied to your account. Okay. If the budget came in, or the actual came in higher than the budget, then you are liable for that amount, whatever that is. I will tell you, good property owners are pretty good hitting their numbers. They have historical data to go from. The biggest issue with triple net is something we can't control, and that is snow. We hate snow in property management. It is something that is uncontrollable, that there'll be years where you budget for snow removal and you have a light year and you do really well. But I can tell you, if it is a rough winter, it can cause some problems with triple net. So that is what triple net is. A gross lease is really an all-inclusive rent, meaning the property owner pays for the property taxes, the common area maintenance, all of that. All you are paying is utilities, in addition to your base rent. Gross leases, we don't see a lot of them. There are some. But remember, in a gross lease, the property owner is taking into account the property taxes, the building insurance, and the common area maintenance. So if a building was a triple net lease, a space, and it was $12 a square foot plus triple net, on a gross lease, that marketed rent may be $16 a square foot. So typically you're going to see the gross lease rate higher than what the base rent would be for a triple net lease, because they're taking into account that they're paying those property taxes, insurance, and common area maintenance. So at least sophisticated property owners are going to make sure they get that covered. It's just buried in the gross lease rate. So eyes wide open on that. And again, another example, $14 a square foot, triple net, and triple net is quoted at $4 a square foot. So your base rent is the 1,000 times 14 divided by 12, which would be $1,166 a month in base rent. Your $4 a square foot for additional triple net would be another $333 a square foot. So your total monthly rent for that particular year is $1,501. Remember, triple net will be adjusted on an annual basis. A good broker on your behalf is going to try to, what we do, cap that triple net so it can only go up a certain percentage per year. So you don't have dramatic increases. Sometimes we can get that done, sometimes we can't. I will tell you, when I started in commercial real estate many years ago, a triple net rate of $4 or $5 was a great triple net rate, and even $5 we thought was high per square foot. We have triple net rates now that are pushing $15 to $16 a square foot, which is a result of the property tax situation, in our area. So we don't see $4 or $5 very much anymore. We may see it in some industrial and warehouse properties, but retail properties, I mean, I would say the normal is probably $8 to $9 a square foot now, but it has definitely increased over the years. Jordan? Rent escalation. So rent escalation, obviously is what it says, is that your rent is most likely going to increase on an annual basis, or it's some periods of time. We're always going to ask that we have fixed rent on the client side. We're always going to ask for, oh yeah, it's $12 a square foot fixed for 5 years. Landlords won't agree to that most of the time. You're going to see some kind of annual increase. It could be based on the consumer price index. It could be based on just, 25 cents a square foot per year. It's really a negotiated situation. A lot of folks say, well, if I'm paying triple net, then why should I have a rent escalation also? Because any increases in their expenses are covered in triple net. Yes, that's true, but to keep the property at market rate, especially for the banks that are financing those owners, they want to see rent escalations to keep the rents at a market rate. Sometimes we'll see rent that goes up, once every 5 years, but the consumer price index is the escalation is calculated based from year 1 to year 5. So you're getting somewhat annual increase. It's just over a period of time. Options to extend. say you have a 5-year lease, but you want to be able to extend that beyond the 5 years or whatever your initial term is. We always want to write in that ability for you to extend that lease. So options to extend is a right granted to the tenant during the lease, when you sign the lease, to extend that lease for a period of time at a rate agreed upon. These are great for the tenant because they provide you the ability to extend your lease for, it could be 2 5-year terms. So if you have a 5-year lease, you have the ability to be at that space for 15 years. Once that option is granted to you in that lease, it cannot be taken away unless you are in a default situation within typically a 1-year period when your lease is set to end. So it cannot be taken away. It cannot be taken away if the property owner sells the property. That is a tenant right that stays with you. And so if we're representing the client, we always want to try to get options to extend. You don't have to extend. You could say at the end of 5 years, I'm done. I don't want to extend. You typically have to provide that in writing at within a certain time period, but we want to give you that right. Landlords, on the other hand, are willing to give that to a certain point of time, but sometimes they like to limit them. So again, if you're going to prepare a lease proposal, I would strongly suggest you write in options to extend to give you that flexibility. Personal guarantee. 8 times out of 10, you're going to be asked to personally guarantee your lease, just like you would if you had a mortgage. This means that if you default, the landlord has the right to try to fulfill your lease obligation by your personal assets. I know that is scary, but that is the way of the world. Typically, you're going to be requested to submit a personal financial statement to see that you're credit worthy to fulfill the obligation of the lease. But they're typically, for the length of the lease, you're going to have to personally guarantee it. I see them on all kinds of leases. The only time we really don't see personal guarantees is if it is a corporate lease that is obviously a very strong company. They may have submitted their tax returns or financial statements, or if it is a national, Chipotle is not personally guaranteed. But our small businesses, for the most part, we're seeing personal guarantees. And remember, if you sign the lease in your personal name, you are personally guaranteeing that lease. Most folks form an LLC or some kind of corporate structure, but if it is in your name personally and you sign that lease, you are personally guaranteeing it. If you're signing it as an LLC or incorporated structure, the personal guarantee will follow as a separate exhibit, a separate document. But that's why we don't really like to see people sign leases personally, where the actual lessee is your name. We'd like to see it more of a corporate structure. Jordan? Rent commencement. That is the date you start paying rent. There are differences. There's lease commencement date and there's rent commencement date. If sometimes they're the same date, especially if it's a move-in ready space and you sign the lease and they hand you the keys and here you go. What we want to do as brokers is to give you some time to get up and running. So typically we're going to ask in a letter of intent that your lease commencement date may be May 1st, but we're going to ask that you don't pay rent till maybe June 1st or July 1st to make some improvements to get yourself up and running. It's also called rent abatement when we do that. But we're trying to give you some time to get yourself ready to get the doors open. I will tell you, there is a lot of property owners who will give some type of delay in the rent starting. But once you open the doors, once the cash registers start ringing, they expect you to pay rent. So your rent commencement could be the earlier of 60 days after the lease commencement date and you take possession, or you're open for business. So be careful on that language. Have the expectation that if your doors are open and you have customers, that your landlord's probably going to want you paying rent. We have a lot of people who come to us and say, once I open, I want 4 months of rent abatement. Well, that's just not the world we live in. So there has to be a reality check when someone asks for that, because it is almost impossible to get done. Tenant improvement allowance. So if you have construction that needs to be done, we may be able to persuade your landlord to provide what we call a tenant improvement allowance. This is to have the landlord help you fund improvements that would stay with their space, whether you were there or not. We typically don't want, a landlord will not want tenant improvement allowances to go for things like signage, or really tenant specific improvements in the space, but it could go for flooring, it can go for painting, maybe new lighting, drop ceiling, those kinds of things. I tend to try to always get some kind of tenant improvement allowance. And it's always usually based on $1 per square foot, like $25 a square foot. So if you had 1,000 square feet, 25,000, if my math is right. I'm not a math person. It can be paid as a lump sum to you. Sometimes it comes as a rent credit. But again, it's the purpose is to help the landlord, or to have the landlord help with cost of renovations that would stay with the building, that they see as an improvement to their structure. You do not typically get that money up front. It is paid once you open your doors or you have a certificate of occupancy, is when you would get that fund. Obviously, if you have contractors in the space doing work, they're going to want to see lien waivers to make sure all the contractors have been paid before they release that money. Okay. Jordan. So to go over the commercial lease again, things that you need to pay attention to and read the fine print. We want to pay really close attention to when your rent's going to be due. We don't want any unknown notices from a landlord saying you're supposed to be paying rent. So pay attention to that. We also want to pay attention to late payment consequences. You know, we can see some interest rates applied to delinquent rent that can get really out of control. And so between your broker and your attorney, you should be paying close attention to what the late payment consequences are and when it is considered a late payment. Typically after 5 to 10 days in the commercial world, it would be considered a late payment. I've seen a lot of people really get upset about late payments, and I'm like, okay, you're spending way too much. You're sending a message to the landlord that you're not going to pay on time. If you're so wrapped up in that, pay on time. And I cannot stress enough, if you're in a situation where you can't pay on time, the best thing you can do is call your landlord or call the property management and be completely transparent on what is going on and that you need some help. 9 times out of 10, that property owner is going to say, okay, let's figure out a solution. Let's work through this together. We realize you're going through a bad time. It is the times when there is no transparency and no communication where it gets ugly or really fast. So always communicate with your landlord, your property manager, and try to keep that communication on a very positive level. The property manager is your best friend. So try to keep that in mind. In the lease, like as I mentioned earlier, let's figure out and really understand who's responsible for repairs and maintenance, especially those mechanical systems. And when mechanical systems, I mean HVAC. heating and air conditioning. We don't see very much trouble with plumbing and electrical, but HVAC is a big one. Typically on plumbing, you know, if something happens in a toilet or whatever, that it's typically your responsibility as a tenant to deal with. It's the lines that are below the building that typically are the landlord's responsibility. We always want to make sure you have the ability to sublet, sublease, and assign your lease or assign your lease. That will be a section in the actual lease. This gives you the ability, if things aren't going well or you've outgrown your space, that you could sublease it to someone else. They take over your lease, and the landlord has to approve that. I'm doing one right now where we're bringing in someone to a retail location. They're in a much better financial position than the current tenant. So we're going to assign the lease to the new tenant, and that old tenant is going to roll off and no longer have any obligation, including a personal guarantee, because the new tenant is in a better financial space. So that's a great situation, but always remember, if you sublease and you're personally guaranteeing that lease, you're still responsible for that lease. If you sublease to another client or another tenant to take over your lease, if they default, you are responsible to make sure the rent is paid, unless it is assigned and you are rolled off on obligation. So just eyes wide open on that. We also want you to make sure you understand what your insurance requirements are. The property owner has building insurance, but you're going to have your own insurance for liability and your personal items within the location. And typically there's going to be some requirement, dollar amount requirement on the liability insurance. As we talked about rent escalations, we want to know when your rent's going to go up. We also want to make sure you have lease options and have that ability to extend. For parking and signage, we want to understand how much parking you have. If you're in a strip center, you're going to share parking. Very rarely do we see dedicated parking in a retail situation. I am one that is 100% against a property owner designating parking for certain tenants. It is impossible to police. You can't call the police if someone's parking in your wrong spot. That's, it says, Jordan's Boutique only parks here. Jordan's going to be the one who's the police. No one else is. So, understand what the parking situation is. Also understand what the signage is. You are responsible for your signage. So if you want to put a big sign in front of your strip center, it says Jordan's Boutique, that's your responsibility. But the landlord has to approve whatever you want to put up, and it must comply with the City of Champaign signage ordinance. So you're going to have to be checking on those items. And then finally, understand utilities, what you're responsible for. Again, typically you're responsible for everything. Sometimes the landlord may be responsible for water and sewer just because there may only be one water meter for the building and it's too much of a pain for them to split it up. It may say it's already in the rent. Garbage is another thing to watch out for. So those are things in the lease just to pay attention to. I think that's it, Jordan. So, again, I appreciate the time. I'm hoping we have some good questions, and let me know what they are.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Mhm.
Actually, shockingly, right now, we don't have any questions, but we have a really large group signed on. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to drop those in the chat. We do have a few minutes here left, so we'll hang out and wait and see if we get any that come in. Oh, we're getting some good stuff and wonderful job comments. We did get one question. It says, I need help convincing my landlord to fund a tenant improvement allowance for new siding, but our next option to exercise isn't coming up until 2027. Does this happen ever?
Does it happen before your option starts? So tenant improvement allowances are typically prior to, as part of the original lease negotiation. So if you need new siding, I would say go to your landlord now and say, hey, this is impacting my business. It doesn't look good. How can we get this done? This would be an improvement to your business. So approach it that way. Obviously with your option, that is your time to somewhat renegotiate the lease, to be honest. Whoops. So you can say, I really want to stay here in when you get to that point, when your option's coming due, I really want to stay here, but we need some improvements to the building, and that may be enough to get them to do it. It's always easier to retain a tenant than to go try to find a new one. So I always encourage landlords that I work with, let's figure out a way to retain this tenant unless they're a complete pain in the so I would say approach them now in a very friendly manner and say, hey, the building's looking bad. We really need new siding. Is there something you can do for this? And you may say, well, yeah, would you like to execute your option now? Even though it's due, it's not till 27, you can always execute it now and say, we're willing to execute our option now if you'll pay for the rent or pay for the siding, and try that approach.
Awesome. We did get a couple more. The next one says, what is the best time for a small business to engage with a broker?
After you have your business plan put together. If there is a need for financing, you probably want to have a pre-approval. But once you have the business plan together and kind of have those questions that I went through, I think that's the time. Again, I've had so many times where someone came to me and said, I'm ready to see buildings. And we spent so much time on it, but they had not thought through anything. They didn't know how they were going to finance anything. They didn't really know what they needed. And I'm like, stop. You need to go to the Small Business Development Center because it was a startup, and you need to work through their process before this time. But I think if you kind of have your business plan together, or if you're an existing business and you feel it's the time, I would engage a broker immediately to help you through that process.
And then the last one we have for right now says, can you say the thing about the signage again? It has to align with Champaign County, ? So kind of just elaborate maybe.
It depends on what jurisdiction you're in. I just use City of Champaign as an example if you're in Mahomet. So every community typically has a signage ordinance, and it's based on there's a ratio of how big your sign can be based on the square footage of the building and the space and all of that. If you call the planning department in whatever city, they should be able to direct you. It may even be on their website, but let's say again, you're going into a strip center in Champaign. Your landlord goes, this is where the sign can be. This is, it can be backlit or whatever. You would have a sign company kind of put together a mock-up of what that would look like. You would submit it to the landlord for approval, and they go, looks great. But you still have to go through the process with the city for the signage permit.
Awesome. Thank you. So we're all caught up on questions, but we did have a couple people jump on after we started. So I just want to remind everyone, you will get this recording. So lots of great information. I know it's probably also overwhelming if you're just starting this process. So we'll share that with you so that you can revisit. And thank you, Marissa, for dropping a link in the chat to everyone here from the City of Champaign's Economic Development Program. We appreciate that. All right. Well, it does look like we are all caught up. So we'll go ahead and close out today's session. Thank you so much, Jill, for joining us to present on today's topic. Wonderful information shared with our clients, prospective clients. And again, like Jill said, we are always happy to help any of you here at the SBDC. I'll include all of the information from today's session along with some SBDC information in that follow-up email later this afternoon. And thank you everyone for joining us. We hope you have a wonderful weekend, and we hope to see you again soon.